Everybody, welcome to Rev'd Up for Sunday. We are the clergy of St. Mark's Episcopal Church in New Canaan, Connecticut. I'm Peter Walsh.
I'm Elizabeth Garnsey.
I'm Justin Chris.
This is our 52nd podcast, and we've had a little bit of summertime in here, and we have not all three been together, so now the three amigos are back, and I, for one, am super happy about that. So, as many of you know, we contemplate the scriptures out loud, and these podcasts are offered so that you too can contemplate the scriptures both with your ears and also with your heart as we seek to wrestle with the sacred pages, with what the scriptures have to tell us. And today we are in Luke 32 to 40. It is the 9th Sunday after the day of Pentecost in the Episcopal Church. And today we have a scripture that's about being tired waiting for the apocalypse, and the advice is don't get tired, right? And we have in there theological teachings about God reversing everything. We have spiritual teachings about the way of discipleship. We have metaphorical teachings about master-slave relationships which sound clinky and clunky on our contemporary ears, and we've got some wisdom about where our treasure is. So why don't we listen to what Jesus has to say, and then we'll have at it. Luke 12, 32 to 40. Jesus said to his disciples, "Do not be afraid, little flock, for it is your Father's good pleasure to give you the kingdom. Sell your possessions and give alms. Make purses for yourselves that do not wear out, an unfailing treasure in heaven, where no thief comes near and no moth destroys. For where your treasure is, there your heart will be also. Be dressed for action and have your lamps lit. Be like those who are waiting for their master to return from the wedding banquet, so that they may open the door for him as soon as he comes and knocks. Blessed are those slaves whom the master finds alert when he comes. Truly, I tell you, he will fasten his belt and have them sit down and eat, and he will come and serve them. If he comes during the middle of the night or near dawn and finds them so, blessed are those slaves. But know this, if the owner of the house had known at what hour the thief was coming, he would not have let his house be broken into. You also must be ready, for the Son of Man is coming at an unexpected hour." That is the gospel for this day. Justin, start us off.
So I actually think that this is a teaching about anxiety. And it's a continuation, actually, of the teaching that Reverend Elizabeth and I looked at in our podcast last week, and which I preached on Sunday. So between the parable of the rich fool, which we discussed last week, and this passage, both of which are part of Jesus' long 10-chapter-ish, or maybe 10 chapter exactly, I can't remember, a 10 chapter-ish journey to Jerusalem, this travel discourse. Both of these stories are about the uncertainty of the world, the changes and chances of this life, and what it means to set one's heart upon God rather than on things of this world to provide one security. And between the parable of the rich fool and this pericope, this passage, you get some of the most famous sayings of Scripture. I'm sorry that they're not in the lectionary for this Sunday, because they'd be a lot of fun for you to preach on. The famous saying regarding the birds of the air and the lilies of the field, right? And so Jesus is saying, don't worry about what you're going to eat, don't worry about what you're going to wear, because God feeds the birds, and you've seen the lilies of the field, how my Father clothes them, he says. And then you get, do not be afraid, little flock, and that's how this passage opens. Right. And I think that what Jesus is saying throughout here is to set your heart upon God rather than the things of this world, in order to actually ground your sense, ground your sense of yourself, and also your sense of your security and safety. And the story here is about what it means to set one's heart in that way. And so he's unpacking that, I think, in this saying about being dressed for action, having your lamps lit, and being available, radically available to God. But that's I think the heart of the passage here. That's how I read it. It's about the alleviation of anxiety by orienting one's heart towards God in much the same way that Jesus in the narrative context has his soul locked on Jerusalem, right?
Nice. Mm-hmm. Well said.
Yeah, I think it's very much a theme of alleviating anxiety. Do not be afraid. Do not be afraid must appear, somebody told me, 365 times in the Bible, one for every day. I don't know if that's true, and I've never counted them, but it's enough that it's a drumbeat that Jesus, prefaces and finishes a lot of his teachings with "do not be afraid" and with "be awake." I think these are his two themes. That this passage can often be read with anxiety, because fear is the factor. Fear is the key factor. Do you have it or do you not have it? And that's how you're going to read this passage. And I love it's sort of nuts. I mean, this would never get an A in an English class, this essay, this little passage, because it's full of things that just don't connect. The characters keep shifting. Who's who? Who are we? Who's this Son of Man? Is he a master? Is he a thief? Is he a father? Is he a servant? Is he a table waiter? I mean, and who are we also? We are the slaves in here, but then the master comes home and we sit down and the master serves us. I mean, it's very interesting. And then we have the shift between a thief, the owner of the house, and the thief coming, and the owner must be ready. And if the owner knew the thief was coming, he wouldn't let his house be broken into. And then it goes on, you also must be ready, for the Son of Man is coming at an unexpected hour, as though the thief is the Son of Man. So there are all these tests for us of, how do we perceive ourselves, determines how we will perceive the Master or Jesus or the Son of Man. And so it shifts, but Jesus is really teasing out, I think, our fear factor. Are we afraid of Jesus coming, or are we ready with excitement and anticipation and letting go of our fear because he's coming? There are just so many layers to this. I mean, there's also the question of what does coming mean? Mm-hmm. And I happen to, this might be a mic drop or something, but I don't really believe in a literal second coming on clouds of glory with, that we're all going to look into the sky and wait for Jesus to come back. I just don't believe that. And I don't need to believe it. And I respect everyone who does believe that and cling to that as a hopeful possibility. But in my own life, I have found that Jesus comes again and again in unexpected ways and by surprise, and never what I expect, never in ways that I could anticipate. Mm-hmm. And I think to be ready, is to really have your heart open, this whole practice of not clinging to an outcome or clinging to a need for it to appear a certain way or to be the way I want it. There's a coming into our lives all the time that we aren't ready for, or that we are anticipating and ready for. So, I think that there's a lot to work with here for people to meditate upon. And, we're called, Jesus is sell your possessions and give alms. It's a lot of us want to say it's okay to have some possessions. You don't have to really sell all the possessions. But if I ask myself, have I ever sold any possession and given the money to the poor? something of value. I think I donated my car once, but I got a tax break for it. It benefited me. But it's that's a big calling, and it's not something we're wired to think of doing. Mm-hmm. So I think there's a lot to really chew on here that's way, way more than a quick reading can give us.
Oh, no doubt, and thank you for your opening comments and your sort of moving into depth here. And I think that some of the challenges we have with the text come from the fact that the text is likely redacted, right? So that we get different teachings of Jesus in different places. And so when we go to make a linear narrative out of it, it seems clunky. You started us off most assuredly. I mean, Luke is an incredible storyteller of Jesus' story, right? And the lilies of the field, don't be afraid, little flock. And that, I always felt that this passage, that first sentence should really be in another pericope, should really be in another biblical portion. And even the self-possessions, maybe you take those two passages and you put them into last week's, and that's really almost the conclusion of it. And then you begin with be dressed here. So just a few comments, and I'm yes to all that you're talking about, so how might we collect our thoughts at this point? So it's the discussion, Jesus is talking about this question of fear, and he's talking about anxiety, and I've looked up so many times how many times it say fear not, and I'm going to say I can't remember the number, but it's a lot. And then we have the whole question of kingdom thinking, right? And where do you put, if the plane flies and it needs a place to fly toward, where do we fly our lives toward? Do we fly our lives toward the things of this world? Do we fly our lives toward the thing of the kingdom? And then we have the spiritual disciplines, the awakening, the staying awake for the coming of Christ as Christ comes to us in our lives. And that is, the teachings of discipleship. So just to touch on the sell all your possessions, which, or no, that doesn't say it. It says sell your possessions and give alms. And it's easy to, this is clearly a thing that Jesus talked about. This is clearly a thing that he said.
Yeah.
And in Mark's gospel, he's talking to the rich young ruler, and in the context, the guy's got all the commandments down, right? And Jesus says, hey man, dude, you got it all. I love you. Now go sell everything and give it away, and then you're going to have the kingdom. You got it all. You're not like 50%, not 80% of the way. We're going to. And then in Matthew's gospel, we get the same teaching in the Sermon on the Mount. But in Matthew's gospel, if the scripture is set out in the right way and we read it, it's done in rhyme and rhythm form, almost poetic form, and you can see how this passage is about rust and moth and where all these things and how this works. And so Jesus clearly told people to sell their stuff and to get rid of it and to give money away to help the poor. That's like bambo. That is smack there, and it might be a hard teaching, but it's a real teaching of Jesus that we are to care for the poor, and we're to care for the poor out of the things that we have. Right? That's out there. There's no avoiding that.
Right.
There's no avoiding that. And then he goes on about the purses thing, which is so beautiful, about putting your treasure in heaven. We might unpack that in a little bit. What does treasure in heaven mean? And then he gives like what I'm calling a wisdom saying, just straight up wisdom. Where your treasure is, there your heart will be also. I mean, think about that quite apart from the gospel. And whether or not that came from Cicero or something like that. And we just finished an enormous capital campaign here at St. Mark's, and thank you to all of you who shared in the capital campaign. And over and over and over, I had the honor of witnessing people giving their treasure to the ministry of Christ at our parish, because this is where their heart was.
Yeah.
I mean, people that didn't have a lot and people that had a lot. They gave it because their heart was. And that is a witness that so often is not seen. And it's certainly not seen when it's very easy in the world to make judgments about people. And I'll just say a lot of people judge St. Mark's Episcopal Church in New Canaan, Connecticut, because we're in our area code ranks as an affluent area code in the country, and a lot of people could write all the people of our parish off or some portion of it. And that would be so woefully wrong to see how these people have their heart with their Lord and with their God and with their parish and give of that bounty. Sorry for that, maybe as an ad, but to say that's how it cashes out, so to speak, in real people's lives. Real people do this, and Jesus is talking about that. You want to be my disciple? Hey, dude, look, or dudette, look at your possessions and give alms. It's a thing.
Yeah.
I also think about the fact that Jesus is addressing people who are following him on his way to Jerusalem, right? These are people who actually have a great deal to be afraid of. They're following a madman to his death. And they're aware of this to greater and lesser degrees, right? It's not that they, I'm not saying they're completely aware of everything that they ought to be afraid of, but certainly these people would be afraid. And certainly these people have, the disciples foremost, but also members of the crowd, right, who are following Jesus around at this point. Many of these people, have they sold their possessions? Maybe some of them have. Have they given alms with the proceeds of those possessions? Maybe some of them have. But what a number of them definitely have done is they've left their homes, they've left their livelihoods, they've upplanted themselves, and they've followed this guy. And so I see this. I really like your image of flight, right? As a metaphor for kingdom thinking. Where are we flying? Are we flying towards the Lord? Or are we flying towards the things of this world? And it's the people who are following Jesus are people who have been freed by God's grace to set their eyes upon God, to fly towards their Lord and to fly with their Lord towards Jerusalem, towards the consummation of his mission given to him by the one he called Father. And to do that, they've had to shed a lot of the things of this world, including whatever earthly security, greater or lesser, more impressive or less impressive, they happen to have accumulated in their time so far on earth. Right? They've had to give a lot of that stuff up just to follow this guy. And so I think the question before each of us as disciples too in our place and time is, what do we have to give up? What is the Lord calling us to give up so that we can actually follow him? That's the question. I think the first question is, where is God going in our lives? And then, what does it take to follow him? And then the rest of these, the rest of the particulars follow from that, right? Because I love the fact that Jesus, the saying of Jesus about sell your possessions, it's totally something that he said. Sell your possessions, give alms, take care of the poor out of the proceeds of your own income. Don't rely on other people to do it, right? It's about sell your possessions. You're not off the hook. It's definitely something which he historically said, because it's just everywhere here. It's everywhere all over all four Gospels. But when he's talking to particular people, like the rich young ruler, he gives a different amount every time. For some people it's all, for some people it's half, and don't get me wrong, I don't want to liquidate half of my assets such as they are at the age of 33, and give all of that money away. That makes me want to like crawl back into bed. The anxiety is so high, to be perfectly honest with you. But it's a different amount every time, because Jesus is taking a spiritual scalpel in each particular case and saying, this is what it's going to take for you to actually set your eyes upon me. This is what it's actually going to take for you to fly with me, for you to set your heart upon the kingdom, for your heart to be set in the way that it really ought to go, that I intend it to go, for your mission to participate in my mission of redeeming the world which my Father made, et cetera, et cetera. That's I think is that's the first thing that I would say about the sell your possession stuff is first ask, what exactly is God calling you to? Where is God telling you to go? And then what do you need to do? How much of your stuff do you need to sell? Who do you need to give to? And so on and so forth. How do you need to configure your economic life so that it's possible for you to fly in that direction?
Mm-hmm. That's really good, Justin. Can we talk about pleasure for a moment?
Oh,
too?
Yeah.
I love that clarity, where's God going and what's it going to take to follow. And I think that's really great guidance and a lot to think about. And then to take that model or framework and move into it with a sense of, because this is supposed to be fun.
Yes.
This is going to be fantastic. And you have no idea how pleasurable, it's incredible. And so along the lines of these great wisdom teaching nuggets, so is this, do not be afraid, little flock, for it is your Father's good pleasure to give you the kingdom. I mean, that's like, you just feel like you're going to fall asleep to that. It's like a lullaby, that just fall asleep in a good way. Rest, restorative, nourishing, like
come to me, all you are
bolstering. I will give you rest. Like, it is the Father's good pleasure to give you, and the kingdom is everything, I mean, here we're cast as inheritors. First, we're disciples, then we're a sheep, afraid, fearful sheep, and then Jesus moves us into inheritors of the whole kingdom, and to think that that's God's pleasure. The whole idea is that we enjoy everything, and have full access and full freedom to move about in the entire kingdom. I mean, that's something that should let all of us just relax and, go ahead, take my stuff, because it's not really my stuff, it's your stuff too, and your stuff is my stuff. And, there was that sort of honeymoon period in the early church where in Acts it says, and they sold all their possessions and held everything in common,
Yeah.
I mean, crazy. So they got it for a minute. And I do think, as you say, people get it in their own time and place. And we have a particular parish that seems to really, really be in the groove of going where God's going. And I learn every day from this kind of, incredible vision and generosity. But I just love the pleasure, and that we're supposed to really get that. Like, you can sell your stuff and it's hard, but if it's not pleasurable, we're not quite getting it,
Yeah, let's talk about pleasure here. Let's plunge into pleasure here, and this is good for you. Coming to you in a moment, because all your work, theological work with Miroslav and the good life, and what does that mean, and what does it mean for God to have good pleasure? What does it mean for us to take a human emotion and to talk about it with reference to the divine, and just talk about the scriptures, which are, of course, a library of theological books that don't agree with one another. And then there's, even within the passages in Luke, we have differences. So in this pericope, we have God's good pleasure, and then these guys have already heard the story. So I prepared the wrong gospel, folks. So if I seem a little right here, I did prepare this, but I kept going. And the next passage is a very, it reminds me of how Phil Action Jackson was when he was on the Knicks. It was very high elbows and a lot of pain. And so if you keep going with Jesus' teaching in Luke, we go, do not fear, do not be afraid. And then one of the passages coming down the pike is Jesus telling a story where fear is the motivator to try to get people to change. So, and to say that with this question of double judgment, he's talking about judgment here. And so how do we approach the divine, and how does that affect how we are going to be? And so, in other words, if we understand the divine as God is love, and it is soul pleasurable to live in communion with God as love in this life and in the life to come, that's a whole disposition of the heart, and a disposition of life, and a disposition of, to my mind, gratitude and generosity. And then there are other traditions where they see God as judgment, and if you don't get it right, it's super unpleasurable. Okay, and so this leads to a whole chain of piety and disposition of fear.
Right.
And I would, maybe I'm a little ham-fisted here, but saying one is a pleasurable of love and one is a displeasurable of fear, and that the disposition of how we approach the divine has so much to do with this, both in our meditations, in our prayers, in our beliefs of what's happening, in our ultimate kingdomness, right? Like where are we headed? Like what's going to happen when we die? For instance, because that might be the ultimate. You do not know the unexpected hour is clearly, none of us have a clue on that. Anyway.
Yeah. Well, I'm reminded that in the Psalms, I'm forgetting which Psalm. I'm terrible at numbers. In one of the Psalms, you can Google it. In your presence there is fullness of joy. And I think that would be my summary statement about joy and pleasure, is that in the presence of God, God somehow is an abundance of joy, just electrifying, sublime joy and pleasure and goodness, and that communion with God is our ultimate flourishing as human creatures. That's the tradition that I'm coming from. And this is a lot of the work that Miroslav Volf and the Yale Center for Faith and Culture have done in the last 10, 20 years to call attention to this tradition within Christianity and to revive it and to help this tradition about flourishing life to flourish. And this is I think that the vision of discipleship that Jesus is giving us in this passage is one that is for our flourishing. It looks counterintuitive to the world, right? And I also want to say that for long periods, maybe even for great long periods, for a very great deal of life in this life, your life may not look like you're flourishing all the way down, right? Jesus is, we follow a God who became flesh and then died a horrific death. And then we look at that God and say that being in the image of that God is what it means to truly flourish as a human being. So you can expect flourishing in this life is going to look odd, right? It is joyful, it is free, right? But it's going to look counterintuitive. It may not always physically feel great, although sometimes it does. Ultimately, I think it's fantastic, right? That's what happened. You know, it's your Father's good pleasure to give you the kingdom. That I think those are words that I think are true for all of us when we die. I really do believe that, because in the presence of God, there is fullness of joy. On the way to that, we have a kind of joy which cannot be taken away from us in the midst of very painful, occasionally painful, sometimes enduringly painful situations that we encounter in our lives. And I'm reminded of the verse from Hebrews where it describes Jesus' mission. It says, for the sake of the joy set before him, he bore the cross, right? And there's a joy set before all of us, because it's our Father's good pleasure to give us the kingdom that can help us to bear our cross, whatever it might be. And I just want to say, I think that this whole pericope is about anxiety, but it's also about this pleasure, it's about this flourishing, it's about this freedom that we find when we're flying towards God and not towards the things of this world. And one of them is, you made a statement which I loved at the very beginning in your intro, Peter. You said that it's a story about getting tired, waiting for the apocalypse, and the advice is not to get tired. That literally is probably, yeah, that does sound a lot like what Jesus is saying. Man, Jesus, he's a son of a gun sometimes. But I love the twist in the story about the wedding banquet, right, where the master's expectation is that he would find his slaves, and just to really quickly on the slave here. The slave here are not, the connotations of that are very particular in an American or in a Western context because of the transatlantic slave trade, right? But racialized slavery, the enslavement of peoples of African descent in particular and so on, racialized slavery is the invention of the 17th, 18th, and 19th centuries. It's not a kind of slavery that Jesus as a human being would have been aware of. So slavery in this particular context is the Greco-Roman context. Slavery, it's an economic arrangement. It's not to say it's not violent, not to say it's not a social arrangement that we wouldn't object to, that Jesus wouldn't object to. Jesus is using the language of his own day, the language of his society, in order to make a spiritual point, as it were. I'm not saying Jesus wouldn't be opposed to enslavement in his day, but his slavery is different from the slavery that we had in 19th century America, over which the Civil War was fought, et cetera, et cetera. Right. So just a huge disclaimer there. But anyway, the twist in this story is that the master's expectation is that the slaves will be ready for the master when he comes home. But when he finds them ready, he fastens his belt, or in other translations, he girds his loins. I love it when loins are girded. You can also translate be dressed for action at the beginning of that. Be dressed for action and keep your lamps lit. Gird your loins and keep your lamps lit. So, the slaves are supposed to have their loins girded, but then the master girds his loins, he puts on his belt, and he serves them. And there's this beautiful passage from one of Cyril of Alexandria, the early church father, one of Cyril's homilies, where Cyril says, since we are weary with toil, our master will comfort us, setting before us spiritual banquets and spreading the abundant table of his gifts.
Beautiful.
And that's, I think it's actually the opposite of the spiritual meaning of the thing is actually the opposite of what it can sound when you just read it quickly, right? This is actually a story about freedom. It's a story about rest. It's a story about grace. It's the Father's good pleasure to give us all this stuff. We just need to chill, set our eyes upon God, and just chill.
And do the work, be dressed for action, gird our loins, and that's, as you said, it's an image of setting about the business of serving, the way that the master will come and serve us, when he comes. Yeah. So I love that. That's incredibly said. One little point that you said, that it's God's pleasure to give us all of this when we die, and I feel like, as Tillich said, if eternity can't be seen in the present, it can't be seen at all, and I think that if we are really entering into this life, the kingdom is right now and here, and also maybe when we die. But if it's not for this life, even when we're suffering, like as you said, not every life appears to be flourishing, or if flourishing for us looks like good job and a nice house and a healthy body and great friends, that's one sense of flourishing. But I think that you have taught deeply on this, that the flourishing runs in much deeper waters, and you can be flourishing in your spirit while everything around you is crumbling, even your own body. And that is something to behold when you know someone's flourishing in that way and suffering in that same way. And we all know people right now doing that. And so, to this idea, I think that takes a lot of work. It takes the work of really, really meditating on God's pleasure for yourself and for your spirit. And I think this passage is saying it looks like doing as the master will do, serving one another, giving, taking care of the poor, taking care of everyone, not just the poor, but being ready, having your lamps lit, being awake. Just being awake is an instruction that's really hard. And so thanks for that framework that you set out too. I love it. I love what both of you said. I just wanted to inject that little present day, possibility too.
Totally. I mean,
know you don't disagree.
No, not at all. What you just said, it just gave me a really great question for my life, which is, what is God's pleasure for me? What is God's good pleasure for me? What is God's good pleasure for you, right? Incredible question. Really worth meditating on.
And so it's beautifully said by both of you and worth meditating on by all of us. And we ask you, in the depth of your meditations with your Lord, what is God's good pleasure for you in your life? And as you're about that, and if this video means anything to you, forward it to a friend, hit like, subscribe, do any of all that sort of digital stuff. But really our care is not whether or not you digitally forward it. It's whether or not God's good pleasure is alive in your life. So peace be with you, and thanks for joining us. God bless. Take care.